So thank you everyone for coming today. I'm going to give it 30 seconds just to let everyone get into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Right, so I'll get started. I think there's some more, hopefully some more people to come, but I will get started. So welcome to this event today, this webinar. It's obviously taking place in Black History Month, and we've got Christine Louis-Dit-Sully, who is going to speak to us about issues of race and racism from her book, which is called Transcending Racial Divisions, Will You Stand By Me? So we'll get onto that a little bit in a minute. Just some basic housekeeping. Just to make people aware, most people will know, but this event is being recorded. So just the chat is available, but just be mindful about that it is recorded and people can see everything. If you've got questions, and we very much welcome questions, the purpose of today's event really is around discussing these issues and having a conversation about ways of understanding race. So please use the Q&A box. It's just easier to pick up the questions than it staying in the chat. So yeah, so feel free to use the chat if you want to chat amongst yourselves. So the event, so let's say welcome to the event, welcome to Christine Louis-Dit-Sully, and I'm really pleased to have Christine here. I think there's a lot of conversations take place in the public sphere about race at the moment. We talk a lot about race, but I think that Christine has a review that was very, very commonly held around race, but actually is probably less commonly heard and discussed now about race. So I think it's really important to have these discussions. So Christine grew up in France and has lived in the UK, in the USA and in Germany. She worked as an academic in biological research, but since leaving research has been focused on researching issues of race, identity and social justice. So Christine has very recently, I think last week, I saw Christine post a picture of her having completed her second PhD. So well done, Christine. That's a fantastic achievement. Most don't achieve one in their lifetime, and you have two, so that's great. And Christine, from the back of her book, it says, I'm just going to read you a little bit about this. She says, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character." And I think, and Christine says, this is one of the aspirations of many when what many had when they fought racism. And I think this is Christine's starting point. So I'm going to hand over to Christine at that point. But I think this is a really important discussion to have because of that, and to think about the different ways of understanding race and racism. So I'll hand you over to Christine, who's going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to have a discussion really about race and racism and identity and how we should approach it in the world today, and particularly in social work. But yeah, Christine, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to start by a negative and hopefully finish by a positive, because it's much better. First of all, I'm going to say that I'm not woke, progressive, anti-woke, unwoke, fascist, or far right. And I'm saying that because I found all this label and these categories restricting people's discussions on the issue of race. And the issue of race is one of the most important issues Western society. So when we approach it by this woke and progressive, anti-woke and woke fascist far right, we are basically restricting our discussions. And we'll finish by hopefully arguing that we need to have a more humanist and universalist approach to the issue of race if we want to fight against racism. So in the book, if you had looked at it, in the book introductions, I wrote why I started basically discussing discussing the issue of race, but also why I wrote the book. I am not somebody who's been years and years and years working on the issue of race. As Susie said in introductions, I started with science, but I was starting to be annoyed by these discussions on how my race is supposedly telling, how people see my race is supposed to telling other people what I should be thinking and how I should be behaving. And I had this notion that things were getting better and that more and more people will not look at me as just a Black woman, but they will look at me as somebody who has particular interests and particular ideas, and they will listen. And what annoyed me particularly is that the people who are claiming to fight against racism were also part of the people who were looking at my race or my racial identity all the time, basically trying to define me by looking at my racial identity. But when I started to do some research on the issue of race and racial identity and identity in politics, I also realized that a lot of the people opposing this issue, actually what I call the people anti-racist who basically define me as a Black person and always talk about Black identity, I call them identitarian anti-racist. So basically they're fighting against racism by using identity-based anti-racism. And this is what I am challenging. And what I realized is that the people who were opposing identitarian anti-racism were basically doing the same thing. The only difference is that they were discussing different identity, or at least they were arguing that some identities are more important than other identities. So basically, when halfway through the book, basically, I argue that identity politics is being a common way of understanding politics today, and that identitarian anti-racists are just part of the identity politics that is being used today. And in fact, what I wanted to challenge mainly, I'm against identity politics, not in the sense that identity politics can be necessarily useful for some people, but more like identity politics doesn't let us go anywhere. But the discussions about identity politics and the opposition to identity politics, for me, is mainly an opposition to left identity politics. And what I started with the book and what I also did a bit more on in my thesis, it's looking at why is it that people want to see only some part of identity politics and why they want to challenge some part of it and still promote this issue that other identities, so if it's not the racial identities, it will be the national identities and the gender identities, the sex identity, the ability, so disabled or disable, ableist, I think they call it, or whatever. But I mean, there is a focus on identity, and that somehow we are not supposed to look at some identities, but still promote other identities. So in the book, when I started, is that why is it that the question was, why is it that the racial identity becomes such an important focus today, both from the racist point of view, the anti-racist point of view, and the people who are basically discussing life or whatever, basically in public discussion. Why is it that our racial identity becomes such a focus? And I started by trying to understand what is race. And the way we see each other is that we seems to be looking at individuals, human beings or humanity, has different racial categories. And so I basically look at how race today, and the notion of race, is seen as a natural divisions of human beings rather than a product of history. So the first part of my book was really to try to convince people that race is not something that is natural. It is a notion that has been developed from the 18th and fully developed in 19th century, that categorize people and basically telling us that some race or different races determine people's point of view, ideas, way of life, behavior, and attitudes, and that these these racial identities basically determine our life. So for me, it's the notion of race is a anti-human notion that has been developed and fully used from the 19th century. And I wanted to challenge this notion, because one of the things that people, identitarian anti-racists today are doing is they are using the notion of race that racist has developed to be able to supposedly fight against racism. And I think this is a bit of a problem, because they are basically kind of making the notion of race as a natural divisions of human beings. And we need to challenge that. And so I started by basically trying to look at how it is a product of history, and that's something that if it's a product of history and it developed in a very specific circumstances and a specific time, this is something that can be challenged and can be changed. And then I look at identity politics in a sense of why is it that, what is wrong basically with identity politics? And the way I define identity politics is the use of social identity in a political world. So we can, each of us see and define ourselves in a way that we want. I mean, you want to use race. I don't agree with the notion of race, but if you want to use the race, you want to use the gender, you want to use the geography where you live, you know, whether you're living in Baden-Württemberg or somewhere else, you can use different things. But the social identity that we have, particular social identity that we have, are being used in politics today. And if you understand identity politics that way, then you realize that the notion of race or racial identity has started long before left-wing identity politics. The notion of race was started in the 18th, 19th century, and the notion of identity politics started at the same time, when a different social identity, national identity, racial identity, religious identity were used as a way of entering the politics world and to argue for interest. So problems with identity politics that you divide people in different groups in social identity, and you use those identity to argue that each of those groups have particular interest, political interest, social interest, and you compete with other identity groups to be able to have the resources or the political power or the social power or the economic power. So this is the problem for me in identity politics, because it's also a problem for people who want to fight against racism. If you want to fight against racism and you argue that basically we are all into different race, black, white, yellow, brown, whatever, I don't believe in the issue of race. If you divide people by this race and you're arguing that each of those race has a particular identity with different definitions, with different interests, then you basically argue that those black people with a black identity will not have the same interests as a white identity. And this is, for me, a big problem for anti-racism today. I also forgot to I just lost my train of thought. I wanted to address a point. I just thought about it now, but that's it. So for me, the book was basically to first challenge this issue of race, and to challenge then the issue of the using social identity in a way that we want to change the world, because we cannot change the world by competing with different identity politics, identity groups. And we have to be able to discuss and understand what will be the interest of humanity as a whole in changing the world. What will be the interest of whether you're black, white, woman, man, gay, lesbian. But at the moment, everything that we look at today, what the left has done basically is given up on any other universalist politics. And all they've been doing is using the identity politics that's been developed in the 19th century by the right and elite groups to be able to fight for their interests. I don't know if I'm being very, but I think I stop now. I prefer to answer questions. I stop now.
No, that's great. And I think that's a really important, a really important issue that we need to get back to discussion, and that is, does race exist? Is the whole premise upon which we sort of discuss race today, politically and in other sort of structures, is the idea that we accept the principle that races exist and that there are these distinct categories of people that are different based upon the colour of their skin, even though actually there's quite a lot of evidence that nearly all evidence suggests that that's not true, but it is still quite a pervading sort of belief, and a lot of the public policies that we are working with. So things like decolonisation as a concept within sort of schools and universities and public bodies and things. I sort of sometimes wondered when you were saying, is the best way of decolonising to actually remove the concept of race altogether, or to at least be progressing towards an end point of not having race? Is race ultimately the sort of the ultimate expression of sort of colonialism within some of our institutions?
Actually, that's what one of the ideas that I basically thought when I was started to write the book, because for me, I just realized it's not only the problems of racism and anti-racism, it's the problems of racial thinking. And I think, because I wrote the thesis after the book, but I think in the book, I try to basically show that our problem is, if we want to challenge racism, we need to first look at the notion of race and challenge the notion of race. And what I mean by racial thinking is basically looking at the world through the issue of race. I read a really interesting book that is hardly talked at the moment, is on the issue of race. It's from Ivan Anoford. He wrote it in the 1990s, I think. And it's basically, it looked at how the issue of race developed by basically going against politics. And so in the Greek or the antiquity ideas is that you still look at the rational human beings, and then through history, the notion of race basically could develop because first we look at humanity through the issue of religion. So we were humans and members of the religious communities, and no more humans part of a political community. And then we end up being humans part of the natural community. So the idea of biological man was an important step in developing the issue. I'm looking at you and looking at myself, so it's just real. Anyway, the notion of, I'm really not, it's psychological. The notion of race developed because of different steps that you had in human history. So the religious community became the biological man, and then when you define humanity as in the biology, then you can define somebody as the skin color and the nose and the lips and the hair, and then you define people in a biological way, and you just separate them. So, and the notion, for me, the notion of race, it's an anti-political, anti-human category that we have to challenge. Nobody is arguing, because when people said that, it was about, you can say there is a difference between you and me and other people. Nobody in humanity has disagreed that there is a diversity of human beings. We all, I mean, we look different. There is people from all kind of skin colors, all kind of type of hair, different type of hair or biological or even genetics. So nobody is arguing against, is arguing that there is a diversity of human beings, but the rest is it's a classification of humans depending, in the beginning it was on the level of biology, but now it's on the level of culture, because I also use in the book the ideas of how culture has been replaced, how culture replaced race as a way of categorizing people, and basically saying that we have a category that defines people, and then that category, that membership of that category, determine their behavior and their ideas and their opinions and their thought and their religion or whatever. So this is what I actually, when I started the book, I was surprised, because for me, this idea of race has been, I mean, scientifically has been in one way, what do you call that? Basically, the science has already shown that it's nothing to do with science. Race is not a scientific category. That's been shown for a long time now. And so when I started, I was thinking, oh God, everybody knows that race it's not a biological science category. I mean, this is old history. And then I started to discuss things with a lot of Americans. And then I'm realizing, I'm sorry, but I realized, oh my God, there is still people who really believe that it's a biological category. And then I try to understand what it is. But yes, for me, race is a product of history. The notion developed at a particular time in history for a particular reason. And that's what we have to understand.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think I would agree with you. I think that there is, I think if you've read a lot about race, you realize that the concept of race is a scientific, something that can be demonstrated in sort of objective terms. It just doesn't exist in those terms. But I do think that we talk about that the way race is constructed within society is as though it was, that it is this real, tangible concept that you can easily categorize humans into these boxes, and that they fit nicely, and that all humans fit nicely into the boxes in the same way that you can categorize people's length of their feet into shoe sizes. And that doesn't sort of work, but that's still quite a dominant thinking within society. And I suspect that, I think that the social works, a lot of social work education, a lot of social work, the thinking around policies in social work, its starting point is that it is very much that race is a real and tangible thing, that there is a real and tangible difference between people. And that actually that we need to work, I mean, that as social workers that we have some role in sort of in working with that and unpicking that and liberating, I think, mainly people from that. And I think for me, what's interesting about one of the things that you're talking about is actually whether actually thinking in that way, thinking about race as something that is internal, is individual, is inherent in people, is it ever possible to liberate people based upon that sort of way of thinking? Or actually, do we need to go back to that understanding that race doesn't have any scientific basis in the world? And in order, therefore, to transcend it, we've got to sort of break free of it in some sort of way, not sort of not make race a sort of golden cage within which we keep each other.
But even if we say that race is not a scientific or biological category, you cannot divide people in different biological category, it does not mean that race is not real. I mean, we are social beings, so we're in society. So actually, I made the point, my husband is a white man. And we can just, and a lot of people are always arguing that, you can just forget about the people's different race, and we're all equal. And if you behave in a certain way with each of us equal, we are going to be all happy. And I also disagree with this point of view, because even if we realize that race is not a scientific category or biological category, it has a social effect for people. If you're Black, white, Chinese, or Native Americans, it has an effect on your life socially, personally. So we cannot just say it's not real, because it is real. But what I was trying to say is that if it's a social, the importance of race is socially important. If it's socially important, we can also challenge that. We can look at look at humanity, not by looking at the world or the humanity or the world through the notion of race. And at the moment, what we have done is that since the 19th century, we only understand the world and ourselves through the notions of race. I'm not saying that just by changing our way of looking at each other, we are going to change the world, because for me, the notion of race is very much linked to the notion, to the society that we live in, capitalist society that we live. But what I'm saying is that the notion, the way that we look at the world and ourselves through the notions of race is a problem. And as long as we don't challenge that, we will not be able to challenge basically racism in the way that it is today, because racism could, there is no definitions of racism, because at the end of the day, racism is come from the issue of race, and racism will be changing depending of which groups of people are going to be racialized. So today, I think that the Muslims are very much rationalized, the same way that the Jews were racialized in the 20th century. And so the different groups of people are going to be put into this kind of groups of race culture, and then you're going to define them, and then you're going to basically make them determined by their categories. So the notion of racism will change, but as long as we don't challenge this issue that human beings can be understood through the notion of race or culture, then we are not going to challenge this issue. And so what I'm saying is that it is real, because it has social consequences that it is today. So we cannot just, like some people argue, let's forget about the issue of race, because we cannot. It's there. If you're a Black man in America, you do not have the same life that if you're a white man in America. It has some effect. And denying it is just not challenging. It's basically putting our head in the, in the sun.
Yeah. So is racial thinking, there's a difference between racial thinking and racism? So having that there is a difference, but are they, what is the difference, and are they equally bad?
No, I make a difference between racist thinking and racial thinking. The way I look at racist thinking is more like when you have hierarchy. So that when you look at what happened to the Second World War, people basically are arguing that notion of race, scientific racism, was not good, and they disagree with the notions of superiority and inferiority. So today, when you look at, for example, even the identitarian racist, anti-racist, do not look at superiority and inferiority. In fact, this is one of those things that's gone. Even in the issue of culture, it is really hard for people to argue that there was one culture is superior to the other. So the issue of hierarchy that the racists are using has gone, but the issue of race has stayed. So for me, the racist thinking is when you still using the issue of superiority and inferiority. The racial thinking is that when you use the notion of race to divide people. For me, the most important, of course, inferiority and superiority has an effect on people. I mean, if you think that some groups of people are inferior, you're going to act on that. You're going to build a society with this notion that they are inferior to you. But the notion of race is also a problem, because I'm looking at how, the beauty of human beings, for me, the way I understand human nature, is that we have the possibility for us to understand ourselves, understand the world, make decisions about those understanding. So we can understand the things around us and ourselves. We can make decisions about those understanding, and we can act. And when we act, we transform both our world and ourselves. The problems with the notion of race is that it really go against this understanding of humanity. And it's not only about race, it's the problems of identity go against the understanding of humanity. It goes against this understanding that human beings has a reason. So, and what I mean by reason is that they have the ability to understand what it is about themselves and the world. And they have the ability to transform themselves and the world as well. So identity and race are really notions that really are anti-humans. That's why this is the point I was trying to push in the book, is that it's anti-human and anti-political, because politics is a human activity that makes us who we are in one way.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think that's that I think that comes across very strongly, to be fair, in the book, Christine. So do you think in that sense then it is actually, if the focus on identity, does that do people who are what we might consider, so in a like a social work context, are sort of vulnerable, does that make them, put them at a disadvantage by over focusing upon their sort of their characteristics or their identity characteristics? Do we in a sense, are we at risk of locking them into a sort of way of thinking that prevents them sort of overcoming with their own agency those sort of difficulties?
So you're saying if a social worker concentrates too much on identity, are they preventing people to
to effect change, to sort of become, sort of to achieve their sort of human potential, and to sort of to change in a sense, and to effect change in their life that means that they can achieve their potential, I suppose?
Somebody called Mary Moran had a very good and then another interesting book, which I found, is that basically she crossed the whole discussions about identity, and basically showing that the issue of identity, or the identity, is a classification that basically fixes people's. So it's the identity itself is a problem. It's basically you fixing the definition on people, but there is a difference between what you do as an individual and what you do as a group, so as humanity. So how you understand other people. So as an individual, you may think that I don't know, yourself as an individual, as a woman, for example, this is the most important part of you. I mean, this is your own, the way you see yourself. But if we divine and if we understand humanity through identity, that is where it is the problem. So in social work, if I'm understanding, is that in social work, for example, I don't know if they do that all the still. If you have, for example, a family with Black kids, and you want to have the Black kids to a foster family, and you're saying that because this kid is Black, it has to be with a Black family, you are creating a problem, because you're basically saying that it's the only his identity is so important, his racial identity is so important that it can only be understood by a Black family and not a white family, and you're preventing that child and the family to basically, you're preventing their agency. What you're saying, you categorize them, and you determine their positions before you even know them. You see what I mean? It's, for me, this focus on identity will be a big problem for social workers, in the sense that you basically, you put people into a fixed category, into fixed classification that they cannot get away from. I read somewhere where people were saying that a child who is born, for example, from I think I gave the example in that book, I don't know, from Philippines, for example, a child was born from Philippines, and only born in Philippines, from Filipinos, will have to be in with family that is related to that background. And they will have to know the culture of that background. And then you're thinking, if the child is brought up in Britain, why would he need to know the culture from the Philippines? He's been brought up, he's been socialized in a certain place with other people around. So what makes you think that just because of his genes, that he has to have a certain way of thinking? You can see how restrained and restricted this notion of identity, and especially racial identity, is. Racial and cultural identity is. I'm putting racial as cultural too. So it really restrains people.
I think, and these things, that is a very significant factor in decisions. I wouldn't say it's the only decision, but it is a very significant factor in decisions around things like placements and adoptive placements and foster placements and things like that. So it is very significant in social work. We've got a question from Elaine, who says, given we know social work does not generally help young people in care with the construction of their life histories very well, how might Christine think her ideas can help people think through how we should support young people to think through and have a strong sense of self?
So she's saying that the social work doesn't work.
Yeah. I think there are definitely some problems in terms of how we work with children in care. Their outcomes are really bad. I mean, in part, probably not entirely, but they're across as a group, at an aggregate level, outcomes are not very good for children in care. Now, I think that won't be just about. That's often about the reasons why they're in care as much as anything else. It's not necessarily just about social work, but I think it raises that question really about how do you support people to have a strong sense of self, I suppose, particularly around race, given that we do have large enough that children from particular racial identities, so Black, African, Caribbean, mixed race children are overrepresented. Definitely, I can't think of all of the what the figures are off the top of my head, but definitely I think mixed race children are overrepresented in the care system in proportion to how they're represented in society.
My vision is more of I always make a difference between fighting social problems and then having individual attitude and personal attitude. I mean, as a social problems, I think that we need to. I mean, I'm a left-wing person who understand the basis, basically the material and social basis of our problems today. As an individual level, I would say that you will have to kind of for the kids to basically show them that their race or their gender doesn't determine the future of their future. Basically, I mean, it's one of those things that has been always very important. I mean, my parents always kind of never told me that just because you are black or a woman. Well, actually, in the past they had that, but you try to show to the young kids that their certain identity doesn't determine. So basically, you're challenging the idea of identity, because you're saying that being a woman, being a gay, lesbian, being a Muslim, or being a black person or white person doesn't determine your future, or at least you don't want it to be determining your future. It does not mean as an individual you can challenge the social barriers. So I'm not somebody with the conservatives who are arguing that just because you work hard you're going to succeed, because we're still living in a society where people have social barriers that they have to deal with. If you're a poor person, a working class person, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to become, the queen, for example. Yeah. I don't know. We have social barriers that the individuals have to deal with, but we can challenge the idea of identity in the sense of that is what determines us. I think for me, one of the problems when I look at the issue of identity and the self during the PhD. There is a long history of discussions of understanding humanity and the self and identity. And I think what we're doing wrong today, it's the focus on individuals and the focus on identity as an internal thing. So it's as if our internal mind and our internal person can define who we are. And I think that's one of the problems of today, because at the end of the day, we are not individuals in aggregates of individuals. We are social beings. So what we are, it's determined in the sense of its influence, not determined, but influenced by our society that we are living together.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really important, really, isn't it? And I think in for me, for social work, I wonder if what we should think about is, I think there's a sense in social work that we as individuals, we work with individuals as social workers, work with at a very sort of micro level in society. We work with individual children, individual families, individual adults. But I think there's a sense that actually as a profession, we can challenge some of those larger structural barriers that are in place for people in terms of achievement. And I wonder if what you think about whether there is a danger in getting those two things mixed up, that actually there is a difference in how you approach an individual and any issues around identity as an individual, and then about how you challenge structural problems. Although I think there's probably some difficulties around the term structural, because it seems to me to be used quite randomly and not perhaps in the way that I sort of think of it. But does that make sense in terms of that sort of the confusion between dealing what you need to do in order to challenge structural barriers and what you need to do with individuals who might suffer individual sort of problems, individual troubles, as they were?
I think this is one of the issue of all social problems. I very often argue that social problems today are not seen as social, in the sense that we always, for example, racism is a good example where the issue of racism is the way that people understand racism is at the individual level. So that's also the reason why you can have a very easy discussion on white privilege, because since the Second World War, they present the issue of race, or the issue of race and racism, not as an issue of as a social problem, but as individual problems. It's individuals who are uneducated. This is how they end up after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. The people who were promoting the issue of race basically argue that and problems of individual education and problems of individual behavior, and so they basically make it a problem that is social into an individual problems. And this is what we do all the time. I mean, the issue of poverty is another example where it's no longer pretty much seen as a social problems, so problems within the society that we are today, but it's the problems of individuals, individual poor, individuals. And so if you are a social worker and you work with individuals, I think you have to be aware that you cannot challenge social problems at the individual level. And the moment, I imagine that a lot of people try to promote or to challenge social problems at the level of the individuals. And so you cannot fight poverty by saying to people, don't be poor. I mean, this is a bit ridiculous way of arguing, but what I'm saying is that there is a difference between individuals and the social problems, and at the moment it's conflicted. So a lot of the issue are seen as, and not only the issues, but the solutions are seen as the individual level. I'm arguing against the anti-woke. That's why I said in the beginning that I'm not a woke person, but also not an anti-woke person, because a lot of the people who are arguing against wokeness or progressives are using individual solution. And if you hear quite a few, some of these individuals, they're arguing that if Black people were not acting like victims, then they will be better. If women were, learning science, then there will be more women in science. And so basically they understand that there is a problems, but they're making it from a social to an individual problems. And for me, it's a bigger problem because you're basically forgetting a big part of our life.
Yeah, and I think that's quite an important thing to understand in terms of the difference between, because I think perhaps for some people there doesn't necessarily feel like there's a clear difference between what, do you know what I mean, the sort of position of saying, well, actually you can't fight these things at an individual level, but equally you don't want to go right to the other side of this and to sort of say that the structural, there's a bit where you're accepting that there's the structural, but the individual isn't the solution. It's that there is this space between the idea that it's an individual problem and it's an entirely structural problem. Do you know what I mean? It's something that you have to deal with at a structural level.
I mean, the counterpoint of the conservative, when I call it conservative point of view, because when you're discussing the individual, but or the liberal point of view, the other side of the liberal point of view is the left-wing people who basically are arguing that individuals are poor and there is nothing they can do. So basically, they end up, if they don't use the identity or the biology as determining human beings, they will use society as determining human beings. And basically, it's two different points of view, but a mirror point of view. Basically, completely forgetting this notion that as human beings, and I keep repeating it, as human beings, we have the ability to understand and transform ourselves and the world. And that is, I think for me, this is one of the most important ideas that has been forgotten. And because it has been forgotten, we are where we are today. So either you have the individuals being responsible, so white people are responsible for racism, which really annoys me. And you can see that actually. And then you have the ocean of, we cannot do anything about it. Society, it makes us the way it is. So it's basically forgetting who we are and define ourselves as an identity. It comes from the issue of individual. Identity is a liberal individual.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I want to pull out another idea from your book, which I think is really, it's often talked about within the, I think we often talk about it, but you don't get a really, but it's often skirted over. It's not talked about in any detail. And in your book, you talk a bit about slavery and racism. And there's so on the page 48, you say at the bottom, but I agree with Eric Williams when he noted that slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racial twist has therefore been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery. And I think we're often, when we talk about the impact of history upon the individual. So you often hear people say that talk about their history, which is, and when they talk about their history, they're not necessarily talking about their own personal history. So they're not talking about their great aunt Mary, or do you know what I mean? That sort of thing. They're actually, this is quite a sort of abstract notion that the history of all people with black skin is my history, that sort of notion. But actually, I think is that I wonder if sort of slavery and the sort of history of this history in some ways for black history, whatever that is in a sense, has been reimagined in the image of identity politics, and we don't necessarily look at it, and it's been reimagined into our current notions of identity around race because of how dominant that sort of some of those things are around what happened with slavery as one issue. I mean, I think there are more than just the slavery is one issue, but I think there are others.
There is different things in that questions, because you have slavery, which is not, I wouldn't call it black history, it is history. Yeah. And then you have the discussions about black history as if there is a history specifically for black people. And I don't agree with this issue of black history. You don't have white history, you don't have black history, you don't have Chinese history or whatever. I mean, you have history and different events. On the level of slavery, slavery is very linked to the issue of capitalism. But what I was trying to say is that it's not the way people see it is that somehow slavery started because people hated black people, and that they wanted to use black people, and they thought that they were inferior, and then we wanted to use black people as inferior, or when they were at the time they were seeing also black people as not human or subhuman or whatever. And for me, slavery is started as an economic issue. The issue of slavery is linked to the issue of labor. how they needed to have labor, a big groups of people to work in different plantations or different industry. And at the time of slavery, we also have to, people are forgetting also, is that you have also indentured servitude. So in the beginning, actually race started with, without even being with the black people. The issue of race started with the issue of different people. The lower working class were seen as a different race. So it wasn't even a skin color. Race didn't start with a skin color. So people always trying to use slavery as a way of explaining why you have the problems today and of the positions in black people. And in one way, it has an effect on it, but it's not about hatred of eternal hatred of black people. This is how people was using. It's like slavery is about black people being always being hated or always seen as inferior, and this is why we have to discuss it. I think you were discussing. For me, this issue of Black history is a problem because you are again using this idea of racial identity. So you're saying that you can have the history specifically on Black people, and then there is nothing else around, as if Black people have always been separated from the white people. You have to remember that a lot of the original people were not seeing themselves as, I'm talking about white people, so they were not seeing themselves as white. People were seeing themselves as British or Spanish or Portuguese, but they were not seeing as white people, and the same way that they were not seeing as Black people. So when you talk about Black history, you're basically going backwards and putting a concept into a history that was not an issue of white and Black.
Yeah, is that quite a thing though with sort of identity, the sort of as identities, because I think you're right actually, in fairness, that identity politics has been around for a long time, I think, but we are in a sort of period where it's really very much in people's sort of at the forefront of political debate, whereas perhaps this is, you might disagree, but perhaps in the past it's been less prominent, whereas it's been definitely sort of forefronted now in terms of politics. Is it sort of part of the problem that actually you have to, in order to keep it there, in order to have that view, you have to reimagine what's happened in the past? You have to sort of reconstruct history in the image of what the way you're looking at things today, in order to understand, for it to make sense, I suppose.
For me, identity politics started, at least I haven't, in my mind, I haven't completely understood exactly how to define it, to define the start, but identity politics, for example, using racial identity started, or a national identity was also one of the first identity politics, and the nations well, I wrote in the book, the nations was used by defining nations through race and then through culture. So identity politics started in the past, from the 19th century at least, and it was as a way of basically arguing for the different interests. The reason why we are discussing identity politics today is because of the left identity politics. And what I was trying also to do in the book is to show that basically, I will use left and right. The left use a right politics for their own purpose, and that is the problems. So identity politics was started with racial identity and national identity, and the left in the 20th century gave up on the issue of universalist politics to go and use identity politics. So for me, it's a defeat of the left-wing politics. That is the defeat of the left-wing politics is the reason why we talk about identity politics today. What I mean is that identity politics has been taken up, it has been existing from the right, conservative and liberal, but the left has taken up identity politics himself, and every other universalist politics has disappeared. So even, for example, when you look at the working class identity politics, is that the way that we define working class has been defined by, for example, Marx in a very objective way. It was a scientific category, understanding the social relations between different, working workers and the social relations of production. Today, when you look at the working class, we look at identity. So how they have a different ways of life, how they have different traditions, different culture. When you look, even working class has become an identity. And that's what the left has done, is that they have taken up a way of understanding the world from the right. And and now we have identity politics and no politics anymore. And so everything is about identity politics. And the opposition to identity politics today is only targeting one, because the opposition to identity politics is basically the opposition to the left. So they are arguing that racial identity, when the Black people are arguing for their own interests, this is wrong. But if and actually in Britain, they're arguing that some people are arguing that let's not be united around race, Black or white. Let's be united around Britain, national identity. So they will be opposing the racial identity and arguing that national identity is better. In one way, is it better? Because both of those identities are dividing people. They are saying that, one group are saying that if you're looking at people's skin color, they have the same interest. And the other is saying, if you look at people's culture, they have the same interest. So you are dividing people. You're saying that some people are united around their culture or their race, and other people are outside their race or their culture. But one will arguing that the racial identity is more important. The other one is arguing that the national identity is more important. Both of them are doing identity politics.
Yeah, so essentially everyone's just started. The reason it's become so dominant is because all political spectrums are arguing politics from that same perspective of identity. That's what, through that same lens.
That's what I'm thinking. Is for me, is we are in the time of in a time where any ideas of politics were as humanity. In the past, when people were discussing, for example, capitalism and communism or other issue, they were looking at how society could be good for humanity. This is a different point of view. You're looking at, I think communist is better for humanity. I think capitalism is better for humanity. Today, it's like, I think for Black people it's better. I know for white people it's better. For British it is better. For the white woman it's better. The men. So you know what I mean? Is that any notions of humanity or universalism has gone. Universalism used to be the left point of view. It started with the issue of enlightenment, superficially in a way, but it used to be the idea of changing society for the good of humanity. That has gone. Yeah. That is about that
lack of discussion about transforming society into a society in which we all want to live, rather than focusing on specific sections of society.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm looking at identity politics as. That's why I challenge quite a few people. I'm saying that you may think that you're against identity politics, but all you're doing is a competition between different identity groups. So you're arguing that your identity, your focus on certain identity is more important than other people's focus on identity. How can you argue that the national, and so people are arguing, for example, the national identity is better on the level of democracy. We are within nations, and you cannot argue that there is democracy within nations. And national identity has started in the 19th century in the same time as race. And they're arguing that somehow by living in a nation, we have a certain way of life, certain cultures and certain identity ideas. And if you disagree with those things, you're a traitor, basically. You're out of this national identity. So it has also the same way as the racial identity. And they argue basically that one identity is more superior than the other. All you're doing is a competition between different groups of people. And basically it's a fight for resources by different identity groups. And nothing to do with understanding what will be good for humanity as a whole.
Humanity, right. And I think that's, I understand that. And I think, so we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So we've got one from Angela, who says, do layers of oppression explain the intersectionality of violence perpetrated against Black women?
I have a problem with intersectionality because it's I understand the basis of it. Basically they're saying that if you're a Black person and if you're a woman, you have basically the oppressions of both what the Black people are had to deal with and the oppression of women. But the problem with the intersectionality for me is that it's looking at human beings as a kind of a mathematical category, you know. Basically, it's basically saying we are two identities put together, and then this is one plus the other, and then it will understand us, our oppression. And for me, it's I will say it's also anti-human way of understanding society, because it's also a very individualist way of looking at it. It's basically you're saying that your different identity put together will describe who you are. I'm not as opposed. I understand where they're coming from, but I just think it's a very wrong way of understanding the issue that we have to deal with, the social problems that we have to deal with.
No, that's and I think the concept of intersectionality is quite dominant in social work as a sort of, I mean, to be fair, I think it's dominant perhaps or in a lot of places, but it is definitely quite dominant in sort of social work at the moment. So I think a lot of people will understand that, and have been a lot of social work courses will teach people about intersectionality. But yeah, I think it is interesting about seeing where intersectionality as a concept positions itself in terms of affecting change within society, that it does locate itself at the sort of individual level, rather than, like you say, having a sort of grand plan, sort of a sort of grand sort of idea about how you can reimagine society.
But when you think about if you follow the intersectionality today, you could say, well, you're a woman, you're Black, you're gay, lesbian, or you're lesbian, and you're British, and then you can British, for example, in Africa or whatever, or African in Britain. So you're going to put all this identity and then say, this is how we're going to define my oppression, by adding all these things together. And for me, it's just based on a very in one way, very liberal way of understanding society. Basically, it's like aggregates of people, and the whole social relations that you have in society is basically gone. I'm talking about social relation in a Marxist way. I mean, social relations of production. So the whole material conditions of society, the social system that we live in, capitalism, is forgotten, and you have this kind of individuals with different identity put together, and it's just, for me, it's also a way of avoiding the issue of challenging what's wrong with society today. I mean, how can we free human, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm all about. Is how can we build groups of people to fight for human freedom away from those identity and oppressions of race and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. No, that's great. And then another question from Elaine is, what does Christine think we can do to change our focus on identity politics, and what strategies can be used?
Well,
so how do you change the focus?
That's, I suppose that's what I'm trying to do with I'm trying to understand. I mean, this is why I write the book, and what I'm trying to do with the after my PhD is trying to see how we can build. Basically, for me, is the importance of going back to the more universalist and humanist politics. So recognizing what human nature is about. So not seeing ourselves as determined in the sense of causal determination. That's what I mean by determine. So like basically, if you're black, you think that way, and if you're white, you think that way. So so going away from this understanding of this pessimistic and negative way of understanding humanity, and building an politics that is more of understanding what kind of future do we want? Are we going to fight for the future of different identity groups? Or are we trying to understand what is the possibility for human freedom? So how can we understand? Because for me, one of the problems of the left politics is that they had forgotten that their political aim was human emancipation, human freedom. We, the left, used to fight for human freedom, not for interests of different groups of people, but for human freedom. And this is what we have to go back to in a way. How can we organize a society and ourselves in a way that give us more freedom that we have today? And this is how I'm trying to do. I mean, basically to go back to politics. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, because and I think, am I right in saying that what you're arguing about identity politics is essentially that it isn't politics, that it essentially just isn't politics, and therefore it has no real way of transforming anything, that it's sort of like, it's like a hamster in a wheel. It's not, it cannot produce transformation. It can soak up a lot of energy, but not actually produce anything valuable in terms of change.
Yeah, I mean, identity politics is conservative. It keeps the status. I mean, that's the reason why it's, I mean, when you look at people discussing white privilege with identity politics, it's a very conservative, with a small c, very conservative politics, because it's basically doesn't challenge anything. You put the blame on individual, especially the individual white working class, and then you basically, especially when you are also at the upper class, so you put the blame on the individual white uneducated working class, and then you basically for social problems, and then nothing happened. You know, some people will have more power than others, but nothing happened, nothing changed. So it's a for me, we have to understand. Throughout our human history, we have shown that we have an ability to understand the world that is around us, and we have to carry on doing it, and to understand the society and to change it. One of the also issue that is also been forgotten by the left is the understanding of the social system, the capitalist social system, in a material way, in the totality. So not in a way that we understand between the relation between a black and a white, but understand how the productions that the way that the society is producing and reproducing itself, how that is a barrier to human freedom.
Yeah.
Because for me, this is what is really missing, is how I understand it in a Marxist way, in the sense of, I understand that to understand society, human society throughout history, we have to understand how we're reproducing and reproducing ourselves. Because we have to eat, we have to live. So how the productions of our society is done. If we understand how it is today, and Marx had started to understand it, if we understand how it started and how we can change that to give us more freedom that we have today. This is how.
I understand, and I think I understand, and I think it's about that's about that grand plan, isn't it? That's about a sort of a plan for a different type of society, for something different to what we have today. It's not just about tinkering with the edges. It's about changing the whole basis upon which a society works, the whole. So when we're talking about structures in that way, we're talking about how society, like you say, how society organizes itself, how it's set up, and doing something very different to how it's set up in a sort of capitalist system. Whereas in, like you say, sort of concepts around identity politics are essentially accepting the basis upon which society is constructed today. And they are seeking to amend some things that they disagree with, within the context, without really envisaging or reimagining a different type of society.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at identity politics, when you look at the ideas beyond identity politics, is that there is a notion of limits.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Britain, you have discussions about immigrants and lorry driver and work, yes?
Mm.
And there is always this notion of limits, that somehow there is a limit to our resources, to our world, and that you have to have different groups competing with each other. Yeah. It's a very narrow way of understanding ourselves and the world. So we have to basically accommodate, and that's what identitarian anti-racist has done. They agree to accommodate themselves to what is already today. So now they decided that race is the way that we are seeing each other, and they're going to accommodate themselves with the race. So race relation was one of these ideas. You know, if we black and white, we live together and kind of separated in a way, and so basically accommodate to what it is, the status quo, instead of basically going further than that. And so for me, if we don't go away from this notion of limits and competition, then
I mean, that's very Marxist. Probably one of the bits of Marxism that people often forget is that Marx did have this sense that there wasn't limits on society, that he was very much in about humanity being in control of society, humanity growing, and sort of in a sense sort of being in charge of the world and providing for itself. And that's probably one of the bits of Marxist thought that people are that's not perhaps discussed so much today, around that sort of that idea that there isn't a limit on the world, that there isn't limit on humanity, that humanity can achieve, and that we can just keep growing and growing. Perhaps that's the growth, but I mean the lack of limits on humanity,
or more like there is no natural path, in a sense that what we are today, it's what we made ourselves. So what it used to be human, what it means to be human today is different than in the past, and it will be different than in the future. So we have an open end, basically, future, and people today are looking at a closed end future. And it's true that Marx, a lot of people are saying, oh, I'm an anti-capitalist. And when you look at the anti-capitalist ideas, it's actually the restrictions on humanity more than opening of humanity. Basically, they are saying that we humans are destroying the world or destroying the earth very often. And basically, they are saying that humans has to be restricting themselves to be able to carry on. When in fact, Marx is saying that we have the ability, at least the basis of his argument is that he understood that we have the ability to be able to understand and go further than we have today. When you look and study the capitalist society, he didn't go on the level that, oh, capitalism is bad and I hate capitalism. He understood how this society that was developed at a specific point of view, a specific time of history, because capitalism is not natural, it's a historically specific social system. This is also another point of view that a lot of people are forgetting. They're always looking at capitalism as if it was natural progressions from the Greek and the medieval world. No, this is a very historically specific society. So he understood how it was built, what it means, and also if you understand that way, then you also understand how we can also change that, how it can also end and go to a different society. What is the limit to this society, and how can we go further than what we have today? And so it wasn't about restricting, it was about opening. It was about human freedom for me.
No, that's that, and I think, I mean, that is my understanding of what some of the things that Marx was saying as well. And we've got some three questions have come in while we're talking about that, so that was obviously the subject to be talking about. So so we've got another one from Angela, who asks, how do cultural forces that rationalize a system of inequality how do cultural forces that rationalize inequality sorry, I can't quite. Angela, can you rephrase this for me? I'm not entirely sure. It's not phrased particularly well. In terms of does cultural force that rationalize the system of inequality make how does, all right, so yes, I think I understand. How do cultural forces that rationalize inequality, that make extreme poverty and injustice? I think what Angela's saying is how do cultural forces create that system and create and rationalize systems of inequality such as poverty and injustice? Does that?
But it's not. It is not the cultural forces who does that. No.
I think it might be helpful, Angela, if you can. We could come back to it. I'll leave it, and then we'll come back to it if you want to add something else.
The point is that for me, the way I understand the world that we have today, we have I go through understanding of the society that we have through the issue of class and the struggle of class. So you have the people, the majority of us who are working and who has to work to be able to live, and then you have a minority of people who owns the means of productions. So they own the means for the society to produce and reproduce themselves. And so they have basically the power there. And this organization of society, and so basically this organization of society will create inequality. And so it's not, I mean, there is a cultural forces, I suppose, but it's kind of a superficial.
Is this is a sort of, and I suppose in a Marxian sense, the sort of idea that it's a sort of, the culture is a sort of superstructure, really. So it's an issue that's one way of sort of perpetuating the inequality. Do you know what I mean? That of supporting of. I think I've got them right between the.
I don't follow this structure and superstructure.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah, I found some of the Marxist discussions like.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. I will have to study that. I mean, I have no pretension that I know everything about everything.
Yeah. I think that's the idea, that it's sort of used, that it's the culture is essentially the sort of created by those that are in control of the production as a means of perpetuating their control effectively. That's perhaps not the right way of putting it, but yeah.
But it's more, I think it's, for me, when I look at the issue of productions, I can understand how we can understand, how we can visualize different society and how the society is producing in a different way. The feudal society is not the same as the capitalist society when you look at the social relations of productions and the forces of production. When you look at the cultural, it's more of the level of consumptions. So instead of looking at the level of don't kind of I need to think about those ideas much more, but instead of looking at us on the level of the society that is important, our relationship through the world of productions, we're looking at the relationship of us as consumers, as consumptions. And so then you have the cultural world, and then you were looking at the different type of different groups of people at the cultural and political world, and looking at people through the our relationship as consumers. And this is, so you have inequality for the, I imagine, for the issue of culture, but you have also an important inequality for the level of productions. So. Yeah. And so the level, so I think we can imagine a world still within capitalism where Black will not be seen as, or will not be oppressed, but other groups will be. So what I'm saying is that the issue of racism may change without capitalist society changing. So there will be still inequality. The important inequality, and people will not, human beings will not be free, but we may not have the issue of race the way that we have today. It's not inconceivable to do that. So
it's what you were saying about previously in like the 18th century, there was that concept of Irish people and Italian people being a different race to sort of Northern Europeans or the sort of Aryan races.
Yeah, or it was also not only the Irish, but because I mean the Irish were colonized, but also the lower class. So the lower class were seen as different race. So it's quite, and maybe in a few years being black will mean nothing. I mean, it will be like equal to white, but there will be, I don't know, another groups of people who are going to be seen as unequal. I mean, it's very considerable, but we will still have a problems of inequality. But the problems of the society will still be there. I mean, the lack of freedom that human beings has. So for me, I see it as you can have politics where you disagree with some things like poverty and inequality and rape or that kind of things. And then you have politics where you want the human beings to be free. So to go away from some of these problems that we have to do.
Yeah. The next question, I'll get the last question in because we're nearly approaching the time. But so it's from an anonymous person who says, do you think that colorism, is a form of identity politics, and does it hinder the fight against racism? If so, how do we address the issue of colorism without isolating others, or is there even a need to address it?
Oh, colorism is terrible. I mean, this. I grew up at the time where people were arguing that the paler you were, I mean, as a black person, the paler you were, the better you were. And there is a reality for it. Yes, the reason why people were arguing that is because if you were more and more looking like a white person, you could kind of looking better. And I think colorism is part of identity politics, but it's also a terrible way of looking at each other. Don't you think? I mean, it's like, you know, you are more black than me, so I am more oppressed than you are, and oh God, this is for me, this is really part of the virtual identity. I mean, I was going to say crap, but I don't say
that's okay. Fine.
But yeah, it is. It's basically, it's dividing people. That's the reason when I was saying that with identity politics, you could say rather the pale black person against the darker black person against the medium black person, and then you have the woman and the trans woman and the man and the trans man, and then the way that we are today is the more and more you will have identity groups and smaller. So you have the black person, which is also a lesbian, and which is also, this is terrible. I mean, it's not a solution at all. I think it's just, it's dividing us even more. And
it's sort of, colorism always reminds me of the sort of one drop policy, really, exactly. And the policy of, I can't remember which one it was, where the sort of the Supreme Court judgment in America on I think it was a train, wasn't it, where a man who had the appearance of being white but was actually had some black heritage in terms of, I don't know, some distant relative was black. He challenged the sort of him being put into the black carriage because he appeared white, and he lost that, and that's how, I think that's right, isn't it, how they got the one drop policy in America. It does always reminds me of colorism, always reminds me of the one drop policy, because it really is essentially what the Jim Crow sort of, it's very much embedded in that sort of Jim Crow approach to race. And
because I mean, when you divide people into races, then and you have to also notice that if you have one drop of a black, you're black, but you're never white. If you have one drop of white, you're not white, you're black. This is all linked to the issue of race and how you want to divide people, and so how you had this definition of white being superior and the black being superior. But colorism was, in one way, basically is an effect of issue of race. In the West Indies, where I come from, the French West Indies, it was very much this. I mean, I think a lot of the places were very much the idea that you have to look as pale as possible so that you will have a higher position in society. And he was right. I mean, there was a reality to it, that when you were paler, you had a higher position than when you were darker, because you were supposedly more black and that kind of thing. But this is the argument, the fact that identitarian anti-racists are using these arguments for their own purpose to fight against racism is also terrible, because basically they are arguing, they are using racist arguments to fight against racism, and that just doesn't work. I mean,
no, I mean that is one of the problems with that, is that these are arguments that have just been regurgitated from a period in time when actually it was much more explicit racism, and they've somehow managed to make them very sort of give them modern currency. We've got just a last, I think it's mainly a comment from Jenny, but she said, Jenny says it was really interesting because if we move away from narrow-minded discourses of competition and limits, we remember that as humans we are innately cooperative. Studies show that in the first year of life, infants exhibit empathy towards others in distress. At later stages of life, we routinely work together to reach goals and help out in times of need, yet the focus is on selfish competitive behaviour. So it's more of a comment, and Jenny then said after underneath, apologies, mine was a comment rather than a question, but how do we refocus the narrative?
You're asking me? Because I was going to say, I have a problem with the issue of discussing human beings as being selfish or greedy, because you end up being, again, a way of understanding human nature is in a very biological and very fixed way. I don't think, and basically you also making it as an individual problem. So basically you're saying that the problem of society is because people are not are too selfish or too greedy, and that is also part of the limits that I'm arguing against. I think that human nature is not fixed. So you cannot understand the problems of society by looking at whether we are greedy or always fighting, or this is part of the biological mind that started in 18th, 19th century, decided that we can understand human by looking at our biology or by our psychology. Actually, that's one of the things I also look at in my thesis, is how the psychological self has become the main way of understanding. So we're looking at ourselves through our psychology, and then we understand the world only through our psychology. It's, again, an individual way of looking at the world.
I think that's an interesting thing. That's something that I think that I and some other people have had discussions about social work. Social work's increasingly become focused on psychology rather than more sociological understandings, and attempts to sort of work with people on at a more sociological level rather than a psychological level. But a lot of it, the current trajectory on social work is around moving towards psychology, not sociology.
Everything is about psychology. Since the 19th century, 20th century, especially 20th century, everything is about psychology. I mean, politics is understood with psychology. How can you understand the French Revolution? One day people were going to argue that, well, some people were into fighting and the other ones were, everything is, the world is psychology. And that's what part of the trance is, that we are looking at ourselves with psychology, and everything. So everything is about psychology. It's when you look at the influence of psychology in our life today, it's just unbelievable. I mean, everything is looking for psychology.
I think I would agree with that.
Everything.
I would agree with that. That's and that's probably we are. It's 29 minutes past 1, and that's gone really fast. So thank you very much, Christine, for coming. I think it's been really, really interesting. I think it's a perspective on race that's really not heard that much within the current society. I think we've perhaps unpacked quite nicely why it's not heard and what's happened to society, how society's arrived at this place that perhaps we talk about race entirely from an individualistic point of view. So thank you very much. I think it will be helpful to people, and I think it's helpful definitely to us as social workers to think about actually how we approach race and how we think about it when we're engaging with people, and what we think we are, what we're dealing with when we're talking about race. So thank you very much. So thank you everyone for coming. I have put, some of you might have seen, I put the next webinar, which is in 2 weeks, which is we're going to be looking at engaging with the barriers to engaging with sub-Saharan African communities who have HIV. So so hopefully that will be an interesting webinar as well. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Christine. It's been really fantastic. Thank you. And it's a great book, so people should buy it. I did put the link to your book in the webinar, in the chat, so hopefully people will go and have a look at it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and for the interesting discussions.
Yeah,
Really,
thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.